So what I've got here is a Honda Aero 50 carburetor, and it's very similar to this carburetor. And let me see here. So we've got the throttle stop screw, the idle air screw, the float bowl, the fuel drain screw. You might be, I probably can't see in there. The slide mechanism, etc., etc. Well, anyhow, it's very similar. And one thing you should look at with the carburetor on the bike is mine had a problem. It was leaking gas. You'd see gas kind of just hanging, dripping off the bottom of the float bowl here. And obviously it's not supposed to do that. So that's one sign you might want to take it apart and clean it out. So to take it apart, Honda mercifully just gave us two screws, two float bowl screws to undo. Most carburetors that I run into have four. May not seem like a big deal, but once you take these apart 800 times, you'll appreciate just having to deal with two less screws. And I'll try to keep everything on camera here. And so I think I kind of cleaned this out. So there's the float bowl. A lot of times there'll be a bunch of dirt and gunk and gummy substances in here. And then, oh yeah, and I've taken the main jet out, but it just screws in right here. And then the fun thing about Honda carbs, at least the ones I've seen, is they've got this little float pin screw that goes over the float pin. So, and what I found out was, when I first got my bike, or actually my Honda Express, was they had the wrong float needle in it. And you might have seen that, you might not. So pay attention to how the float goes in. It only goes one way. It's easy to, screw it up, but it can only go in one way. I guess, lawnmowers, sometimes lawnmowers, they'll go in either way, and if they're backwards. And you got your float pin there. And then, there she is. Let's see, are we on camera? In here is our float, is our needle. This is the needle and seat. And so here's the needle. You want to check and see it's got kind of like a rubber coating on the tip. You want to make sure that the rubber coating is still in pretty good shape. I assume it's rubber. Anyhow, it's a substance which is necessary to seat the needle properly against what is also known as the seat. And on the Honda Express, and I think on the Honda Urban Express, you want to have a float that matches the needle. Let's see if I can do this here and stay on camera. This is such a joy. So this needle does not fit in this float because it's meant to hang off this little slot. It's meant to slide into this slot on the float and hang there, but instead it doesn't have what's necessary to slide in here. And so this is the needle that came with my Honda Express, and this is the float, and the two just don't go together, because what happens when you put it all back together is when you put in that float pin screw, the float doesn't want to. It's always nice to have a clean surface when you're messing with this crap too. So, the way it would work is I would hang the needle off of this, and while it's hanging, set this in, and the float pin goes right in the seat, and the needle goes right in the seat, and I would have, let's do that over again. I would have the float hanging off, I would have the needle hanging off the float, I would have the float pin in, I would take the carburetor body, and I would set, there we go, everything right down in. Okay, what happens is, since this is the wrong needle, it pushes up against the float, and the float doesn't sit down as far as it needs to sit down. And that, when you screw in the float pin, screw, which goes directly over the float pin, and you're supposed to be able to tighten it all the way down. But the problem is, since that needle is too tall, it pushes up against the float and won't allow it to go up and down like it's supposed to. Anyhow, if you're having problems with your carb, you want to clean it out, I generally just soak it in simple green overnight. Then I take a toothbrush to it, and then I take compressed air, and after I rinse it, I take compressed air and I spray it all out. There's a gasket here that you want a float bolt gasket that you probably want to replace. This only goes on one way. There's a gasket here that you want to replace. I believe there are tiny little gaskets on the throttle stop screw and on the idle air mixer screw at the end that come with the kit that you want to replace. And hopefully that gives you some idea how this thing works. It's kind of hard to keep everything on camera, but I did the best I could, you know. Again, this is not an Urban Express carburetor, but it's basically the same thing. Let's just look at it. So the Urban Express is kind of sitting like, carb is sitting like this. And we've got, well, this doesn't have the auto choke, but here's the fuel, where the fuel line attaches. We've already got the drain hose attached. This has the overflow hose right there. Here's the drain hose. I need to look on camera as I'm pointing this out. Air filter goes on here. This side attaches to the intake. This is where the throttle goes in. Hopefully I didn't make too much of a mess of that. So that should give you some idea about the carburetor for this thing. And I'll put this away.